more than 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. CNN teams are carefully sifting through the largest, and what the Justice Department says is the last, batch of Jeffrey Epstein files. It's an enormous trove of documents, and it includes references to some of the richest and most powerful people on the planet. That includes the current president, a former president, cabinet secretaries, a former prime minister, billionaires, and the list goes on and on and on. The Justice Department says tonight that its job is done.
We complied with the statute, we complied with the act, and there is no, we did not protect President Trump, we didn't protect or not protect anybody. I mean, I think that there's a hunger or a thirst for information that I do not think will be satisfied by the review of these documents.
I should note that just because someone is mentioned in these documents does not mean that they've been accused of wrongdoing or did anything wrong. Many of these claims are unverified or they rely on secondhand information. But these are the key findings our team has uncovered so far, and I should note, millions of pages have come out. We are still digging right now in this hour. Donald Trump's name appears thousands of times in these new documents. In some, he's merely mentioned in emails that Jeffrey Epstein sent to other people. But the files also contain a complaint from a woman who accused Trump of raping her in 1994 when she was just 13 years old.
What is unfolding right now is massive. The Justice Department says it has released the final Epstein archive, more than 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. CNN teams are still combing through the material, and the scale alone is staggering. The files touch an extraordinary circle of powerful people, current and former presidents, cabinet officials, billionaires, and even a former prime minister. The DOJ insists it followed the law, protected no one, including Donald Trump, and completed its review. At the same time, it admits that public demand for answers likely will not be satisfied by this release alone. And that is where things get more serious. A name appearing in these files does not automatically prove wrongdoing, and many entries are based on allegations, tips, or secondhand claims. But Trump appears in the material thousands of times. In some cases, he is referenced in emails sent by Epstein to others. In other parts of the archive, the allegations are far more serious, including one from a woman who says Trump assaulted her in 1994 when she was 13 years old. Then, almost simultaneously, came another shock. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling against Trump's entire emergency tariff program. This was not just a trade policy setback, it was a direct warning about the limits of presidential power. In Learning Resources versus Trump, Chief Justice Roberts wrote for the majority that the statute Trump relied on simply does not give the president authority to impose sweeping tariffs. That power belongs to Congress, not the White House, not the president acting alone. That conclusion destroys the legal foundation of Trump's tariff strategy. The ruling means the administration's broad tariff program is invalid. Tens of billions in trade measures are now on shaky ground, and more than $100 billion already collected may trigger refund claims. The court's language also sends a much wider message. Presidents cannot stretch emergency powers beyond what Congress has actually authorized. That matters far beyond tariffs. You can already see the ripple effect. As the justices also examine presidential control over independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, including the firing dispute involving former Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, the broader signal is unmistakable. The court is narrowing claims of unchecked executive authority. Trump's reaction made the moment even more revealing. He exploded publicly, calling the ruling terrible, disgraceful, and deeply harmful to the country. He said the justices should be ashamed and even accused the court of having ransacked America. That is not the language of a president merely disappointed by a legal loss. It is the language of someone enraged that a constitutional institution just reminded him he is not all-powerful. And that may be the real heart of this story. This is not only about Epstein files. It is not only about tariffs. It is about a presidency colliding with limits, legal limits, constitutional limits, institutional limits, and reacting as if those limits themselves are illegitimate. The court did not attack America. It enforced the separation of powers. But Trump's response shows how he sees authority. If he cannot act alone, then in his view, the system must be broken. That is why this moment matters so much. The document dump raises new questions about who knew what and when. The Supreme Court ruling strips away one of Trump's most aggressive unilateral tools, and together they paint the picture of a president under pressure from two directions at once: documentary exposure on one side, constitutional restraint on the other.
Now we start this hour with this question. Can the President of the United States take control of independent federal agencies like the Federal Trade Commission? That is what justices on the High Court are thinking about today. So the issue is before the court that the President's firing of former Federal Trade Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter needed to come into question. So Slaughter argues that Congress designed the Federal Trade Commission to be bipartisan in investigating corporate mergers and consumer fraud. Those arguments in court already heating up this morning. Listen in.
How about employees?
Again, we haven't challenged the restrictions on.
I know you haven't challenged it. It's really, the question is, where does this lead? What does it take you to, given what your primary rationale is? Employees are wielding executive power all over the place, and yet we've had civil service laws that give them substantial protection from removal for over a century. How about those?
Well, we do not challenge.
I know what you don't challenge. You're missing the point.
Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariff plan was always built on an aggressive legal theory, and the Supreme Court has now rejected it. The administration tried to anchor the entire program in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, a law meant for targeted responses to real national security or foreign policy crises, freezing assets, blocking transactions, sanctioning specific actors. It was never written to hand a president blanket power to impose sweeping tariffs on imports from nearly every country on earth. That was the core defect. Trump treated trade deficits and drug trafficking as permanent emergencies and used them to justify a global tariff regime reaching 25%. The court said that went far beyond anything Congress authorized. Chief Justice Roberts put it plainly. The Constitution gives power over taxes, tariffs, and commerce to Congress, not the president. If a president wants that scale of economic power for himself, Congress must say so clearly. Here, it did not. That is why this ruling matters so much. It was not just a tariff policy loss. It was a constitutional boundary being enforced. Trump's branding, calling it Liberation Day and selling it as freedom from bad trade deals, may have worked politically, but slogans are not legal authority. The court was not judging the strength of the message. It was asking a narrower question. Did the law actually give him this power? And the answer was no. The broader principle may matter even more. The court effectively applied the major questions doctrine. When a president claims authority over something with enormous national economic and political consequences, vague statutory language is not enough. Tens of billions in tariffs, global trade disruption, and higher prices across the U.S. economy easily qualify. That required clear congressional authorization, not an inventive reading of an old emergency statute. And this does not stop with tariffs. The ruling now hangs over other sweeping executive power claims, from control over independent agencies to immigration emergency powers to attempts to use national security justifications for broad domestic action. It does not decide all those cases by itself, but it gives courts a much tougher standard going forward. The economic fallout is immediate. Because the ruling's logic reaches the wider tariff structure built under this emergency authority, the rest of the program now faces danger as well. More than $100 billion in duties has already been collected under a system the court has now declared unlawful. That opens the door to a refund battle of historic scale, one the customs system was never built to handle. Trade courts are already pressing the government to start processing claims, and repayment litigation could drag on for years. Trump's response made the ruling even more revealing. Instead of treating it as a constitutional disagreement, he called it terrible, shameful, and destructive to America, saying the court had ransacked America. That reaction says a lot about how he views presidential power. To him, constitutional limits look like an attack on the country. The court's message was the opposite. Separation of powers is not sabotage, it is the system functioning as designed. One phrase from Roberts may end up mattering most. He cannot. That wording does not just criticize how Trump used the statute, it destroys the theory behind it. Any future attempt to use the same emergency law for broad tariffs is likely to hit the same constitutional wall. That may be the real importance of this moment. The administration did not just lose a case, It lost a governing theory, the idea that emergency declarations plus vague statutes could justify sweeping unilateral economic action. The court has now said openly and clearly that this theory has limits. Even more striking, Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett were in the majority, conservative justices, including Trump appointees. So this was not a case of hostile outsiders blocking him. It was the judiciary, including judges from his own ideological camp, insisting that presidential power still ends where the Constitution says it ends. What comes next matters just as much. The administration may try to rebuild parts of the tariff regime through Section 232 or Section 301, but those routes come with their own legal and procedural limits. And now every such effort will be judged under a far stricter framework. In other words, this was not just a tariff defeat, it was a real-time example of presidential power being cut back by constitutional limits, and of a president learning that even judges he once counted on are there to serve the law, not him.
Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington as the war with Iran nears the 3-week mark, and the Pentagon appears to be ramping up operations amid new attacks today across the region, including in Jerusalem's Old City. All of this while President Trump continues to suggest the war will be ending soon. Just moments ago, the president speaking to reporters about the ongoing war while leaving the White House.
Well, we've been hitting them awfully hard. I mean, I don't know if you can possibly get hit harder, but these are thugs and animals and horrible people. But you can't hit anybody harder than we've hit them.
Do you think Israel will be ready to end the war when you're ready?
I think so, yeah.
What makes you think
The relationship's a very good one. I think so. You know, we want more or less similar things. You know what we want? We want victory, both of us, and that's what we've got. Well, look, we can have dialogue, but I don't want to do a ceasefire. You know, you don't do a ceasefire when you're literally obliterating the other side.
When the war first began, President Trump suggested it would last just 4 to 6 weeks. And as we close in on the start of the 4th week, President Trump has repeatedly said in recent days that war will be over soon.
NBC's Monica Alba made clear that Trump's promise the Iran war would end soon remains undefined. He has repeated that line for nearly 2 weeks, even saying in Florida that it could be over within days. But that timeline has already slipped, and no one seems able to say what soon actually means anymore. At the same time, pressure is building in Congress around Trump's political future. In January 2026, during a private conversation with Republican allies, Trump reportedly warned that if Republicans lost control of Congress in the midterms, impeachment would follow. That statement matters because it was not Democratic spin. It was Trump's own acknowledgement that a House flip could trigger a direct accountability process. That concern is not theoretical. More than 80 House Democrats have already backed impeachment articles against DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, showing that the impeachment mechanism is active and organized. On top of that, roughly 140 votes had already been positioned around earlier impeachment efforts tied to Trump himself. In other words, the structure for escalation is already there if the political numbers change. Congress is also increasing pressure through war powers votes tied to Iran. Lawmakers are trying to force Trump to seek formal authorization for continued military action, which would compel Republicans to go on record about whether they support an open-ended war without clear congressional approval. At the same time, questions are growing over whether the administration has any real exit strategy at all. Then there is the Department of Homeland Security funding standoff. Trump has threatened to withhold his signature on DHS funding unless Congress passes his voter ID package, effectively tying essential government operations to an unrelated political demand. Republican strategists are already warning that this could become a self-inflicted crisis, one that risks a shutdown, damages the party in swing districts, and gives Democrats exactly the kind of midterm argument that could help flip the House. Taken together, the war powers fight, the DHS funding confrontation, and the impeachment groundwork all point in the same direction. Trump's political survival is becoming increasingly dependent on the midterm outcome. If Republicans lose the House, the accountability process he privately fears may no longer be avoidable.
But despite those comments, the Pentagon is accelerating its deployment of thousands of Marines and sailors to the Middle East. That's according to 2 people familiar with the decision. These images show some of those U.S. service members departing San Diego for the region. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Israeli emergency crews are scrambling after a major attack on Jerusalem's Old City. This was the moment of that strike when falling missile fragments hit. The IDF says bomb squad and border guard soldiers are at the scene to collect evidence. NBC's Richard Engel is making his way to near where that strike happened in Jerusalem and will join us shortly. But joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, as well as NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Cubie. Monica, I do want to start with you. As we mentioned, the president has repeatedly said this war will be over soon, but is it clear right now what soon means?
No, it's really not, Gabe. And the president kind of is giving this answer over and over again and has for the last 10 or 12 days. He indicated at what point when he was down in Florida that he thought it could be wrapping up, quote, within days. And again, that was about 12 days ago. So it is really unclear.
As the war with Iran moves toward its third week, the conflict is clearly intensifying. Pentagon operations appear to be expanding, and strikes are being reported across the region, including in Jerusalem's Old City. Even so, Trump continues to insist that the end is near. Speaking to reporters outside the White House, he said the United States was already hitting as hard as possible and made clear he has no interest in a ceasefire while the fighting remains active. When asked whether Israel would stop if he pushed for it, he projected confidence, saying both sides are focused on winning. The problem is that this isn't what he said at the start. Early on, Trump suggested the war would last only 4 to 6 weeks. Now the conflict is approaching week 4, and he's still repeating that it will end soon. At the same time, pressure is building in Washington. Congress is now confronting questions of war powers, oversight, and funding, placing Republicans in an increasingly difficult position. With impeachment articles already filed and a substantial block of House votes seemingly in place, there's a growing sense that if Republicans lose control of the House, Trump could face serious political danger. Taken together, the moment feels less like routine turbulence and more like the beginning of a larger reckoning.